Okay, some of you will have observed people who weaken to the black. Remember, people who weaken to the black have got low vital energy. And as we'll see, vital energy, prana or chi, whatever you want to call it, is different from ATP or chemical energy. But one is interchangeable with the other. So if you're low in your vitality, you're going to be low in your body energy. So these people need exposure to a form of energy, and light is the best source. It's the quickest source. So they need some light therapy outside. So at lunchtime, instead of having lunch, they can put their complementary colours on and sit there. Now, you've also observed some people probably who didn't weaken to any colour. That may be because the intensity of the light in the room here is very low. Okay, so again, do it outside. And people who don't weaken to any colour at all, remember it's usually a biomechanical problem, and most often it's a problem with the neck, and most often it's a problem with the higher part of the neck where most receptors are. So they may need their neck adjusting in some way in some particular technique. Some of you have observed that people weaken even when they've got their eyes closed, and this is a very important issue, and because a lot of people find that the colour causes neurological disturbance, so consequently they close their eyes, and you don't always observe that they're doing this, particularly behind the blue acetate, because you can't see as the practitioner that they've actually got their eyes shut. Okay? But they still weaken. And I thought, well, this is very strange. You know, I based all of this idea on cones, but how come when they close their eyes they still weaken to the same colour? So sometimes I would move the acetate onto the forehead above, and they would still weaken. So I tried it on other locations in the skin, and again, they weaken, providing they're exposed to the light. There's nothing else. So if I put the acetate on the skin, say on the trunk, with the light coming through, they will weaken, but if I put the clothes over the top, they don't. Okay? Which indicates there are receptors in the skin specifically located for that particular wavelength that they're picking up. So Paul, if I could borrow you again. So we know Paul was a blue-red. So we pinned the two acetates together. Blue on the right, if I remember. Yeah. Okay. So first of all, make sure he's got his eyes open. So we're doing the normal standard type of test. Okay. Now close your eyes, Paul. And we'll see that he weakens still. Now, if we put them in various locations, now we've got two acetates. Now, it was easier when you had only one acetate with a person, the primary one that weakened, but now we've got two. Okay? So what we've got to do is make sure when we do take them somewhere else that we keep them separate on the two sides of the body. So what we're going to do is we're going to put them around his umbilicus. Okay? So we're going to split them in the same way, the red on the left, blue on the right, in the umbilicus. And what you find is a much greater effect than even over the eyes. Okay? It's an absolutely amazing effect when you come to do this, that there are sensitivities to, obviously, wavelengths which the human eye doesn't see in the skin, and particularly around the solar plexus area. Okay? So we know that there's a lot of receptors in the nerve cell, in the cell structure, and also a lot of nerve plexuses. And he can't really hold it at all, can he? It's amazing. It's much more sensitive. Now, if I swap those round and put the red on the right, around the umbilicus, he's as strong as an ox. Okay? So it's very much obviously dependent upon which side of the body they're on, which side of the brain you're activating. I don't know, you know, the ins and outs of it, but I know if you put it around the umbilicus, it's much more sensitive. And as a result of this, you'll start to pick up sensitivities with the person which you can't imagine. You know, that's how I know that every blue person weakens to lactose. Even if they don't weaken to it when you have the complementary colours over the eyes, they do when you get it here. And if you do your hormonal checks and you check for adverse foods and for nutrients around the umbilicus, you get a different story altogether. So the umbilicus is the source of the energy, or I think Sam, you were saying it was the mother, wasn't it? It was the mother going in. So it's the energy of the mother. It's where life starts, through the umbilical cord. And it's a very, very sensitive area. Okay, so when I'm working from strength, and I'll be demonstrating this most of the time today, you can still do it over the eyes, there's no problem. What I do with patients is I show them, you know, that they're a blue-red in your case, with your eyes open. Okay, and then I say something interesting we've observed over the years is that if you close your eyes, you get the same result. Okay, and then the patient said, oh yeah, you're right, I do get the same result. And I said, you can put it anywhere, you know, there, but if we put it around the tummy area, you get an even bigger result. And they say, oh wow, yes, you're right, okay, particularly when you've got 2 acetates on. But if we cover it over with the clothes, well, it doesn't weaken at all. Okay? So in other words, the receptors are not receiving the light on the skin. So what happens is the eyes have got filters. The eyes are only detecting through the cones those particular wavelengths from about 390 up to 770 nanometers. It's very narrow, only about 1 or 2% of the measurable spectrum is what the eyes detect. It filters the rest of the world out. The rest of the universe disappears, okay? But the skin doesn't. The skin receives ultraviolet, infrared, as we know when we're exposed too much to the sun. It receives cosmic radiation, microwaves, radar, and so on. It receives everything, and it picks it up. But luckily, we don't receive that information into our brains consciously, but we do subconsciously, okay? We're hardwired for the whole universe, and we pick up influences, and sometimes we detect this when we're in electromagnetic belts, or when we're in a vicinity of somebody who gives off bad vibrations or negative thinking, we can pick this up. So we have receptors, and most of those receptors, the initial receptors, are in the skin. And we know, and we described this in October, that ectodermally, in other words, embryologically, the ectodermal tissue has 2 tissues in the adult once we're born, and that is the brain it makes and the skin. So the skin, if you like, is intimately embryologically connected to the brain. So it's full of receptors. The skin has the receptors, hundreds and hundreds of different types of receptors and molecules that switch the genes on and off, and also the brain does. And the brain's receptors are the eyes, the nose, the feeling, obviously, from the skin, the smell and hearing. So both brain and skin are intimately connected. So this is why you can challenge on the skin as well as challenging straight to the brain. Whether you want to do your testing orally into the brain or visually or auditorily, it doesn't really matter. The skin still has the same receptors and can send information to the brain. So obviously if you're going to test the value of a piece of music, you don't put the CD on the skin. Okay? You play the music. If you want to test the value of a food, then you can do it on the mouth, or you can put it on the skin, or a perfume, you want to put it up the nose, don't you? But there are certain things that you don't want to continually put up the nose or on the tongue, particularly toxic substances. And when you come to testing makeup and cosmetics, you don't want to keep putting those on the tongue or necessarily inhaling them. And they work very well, and they work very well around the umbilicus. Much better around the umbilicus than anywhere else, providing you use the right coloured acetates, as we can see. Okay, so is that clear? Does everybody understand that? Okay, because you'll find you'll get really quite stunning results. And what we've got here is a situation where we've got a red and a blue, predominantly blue. So what you're now beginning to put into your mind is, rather than just saying, oh yes, Paul's a blue and a red, is saying he's dominated by his gonads. Okay? Okay, so we know where his prime imbalances are going to be. His gonads are his primary coordinating gland. Okay, so everything about him is going to be related to his gonads. In this case, it's going to be the testes. So your brain is thinking testes produce a whole range of steroid hormones. Easy to remember that because they're the same as the adrenal cortical hormones. And the adrenal hormones and the testicular hormones and the ovarians all start with one particular hormone. And that hormone, which is very, very special, is called progesterone. Okay? So that would be the first hormone that we would come to challenge. Now, before we do that, I want to just verify that his primary gland is his gonads, and his less dominant, we won't call it recessive, but less dominant, is the red, is the thyroid. So he's got issues with 2 glands coordinating. So if we use some glandular tissue extract, and this is when we use the actual tissue extract, so we're going to do thyroid, and we're going to do testes. So we'll do the testes first. So I'm going to use the tissue extracts, and again, because he's blue, remember what's he mainly sensitive to in our testing is ethanol. So we cannot use a ethanol vial unless we use the ethanol inhibitor alongside it. So remember that, because it catches me out. I forget to do it sometimes, and I think, why is this person just not showing to what they should show? But you have no fear about that if you use the activated charcoal vials. So I'm putting on here testes, all right? I don't know whose testes they are, but we hope they're perhaps a Spaniard's. Pull. Okay. So we can see that there's no question about his testes, all right? And now we'll put the thyroid, because he's red, he has a touch of thyroid issues as well. He always will. When you're perfect, which we haven't had many people yet, they won't weaken to any colour. A perfect person will be a person who doesn't. And you can see we've got a thyroid issue as well. And what we'll be doing with both glands is going through a sequence of finding out where the problem is in the gland from a biochemical perspective. So when we come to looking at his thyroid, we'll be checking him with T1, T2, T3 and T4 and reverse T3. Okay? And then we'll find out where his problem is as far as his metabolism, where the blockages are, and then we'll be finding out what it is, where it's coming from. And surprisingly, we find a lot of glandular problems down locally here are nothing to do with here. Okay? And what you find is they all feed back to the hypothalamus. And one of the major inputs to the hypothalamus is the limbic area on the inside of the brain, and this is all regulated by the amygdala. So this is the center of the subconscious emotions. So we're finding a lot of people, they may have problems in the gonads and the thyroid, but the real regulation is actually hypothalamic. And the regulation of the hypothalamus, why it's gone up or down, as we'll see, which it does, is due to imbalances in the limbic or the subconscious emotions. So we're playing programs which alter our chemicals, alter our neurology, alter our hormones, and eventually alter our target hormones. And those target hormones have particular reactions in cells to make them do specific functions. And if our thyroid malfunctions and we get a slower metabolism and we gain weight, okay? This is why red people have the tendency to gaining weight. Okay? Green people hardly ever gain weight, okay? Nor do blues. But on the other hand, you know that certain hormones have body shapes associated with them. Okay? Now, we're going to go later on in the day and look at the changes in the structure of people. We know that thyroid people, for instance, tend to put weight on the trunk, as we'll see this in more detail a bit later, on the thighs, on the upper arms, and the neck. Okay, that's the thyroid gain, isn't it? Okay? But the lower arms and the lower legs are exactly the same as they were. Okay? So a person who gains weight in those positions is a thyroid person. Okay? Now this is going to be a red person, whether you're a dominant red or a less dominant red. A green person will tend to put on water, mainly. Okay, so they fill up, and they fill up generally all over. So weight gain from adrenals tends to be very fluidy. Okay. Weight gain from gonads tends to be abdominal, more in males, okay, and hips and thighs in females. Now, we know that the main depositor of fat in a female is the estrogen. And strangely, it's the same in the male. Males who've got too much estrogen tend to put fat on, and they put it on a particular distribution. The estradiol, or E2, the predominant one, which we'll come to, tends to put, again, weight on as fat all over, particularly in the secondary sexual characteristics. So breasts, body, so the big person all over, the person who's got really big, usually has high E2 or estradiol. E1 or estrone, as we'll see, is all around the hips and the thighs. This is the E. And the E3 or estriol is the abdomen. That's the pregnant one, okay, or the apple shape. So remember, and this is really, really interesting, is people gain weight according to their glandular structure, whichever their gland is predominant, okay? So you will gain weight, if you gain weight, in a way which is predictable for your gland dominance, okay? You won't gain weight in an abnormal way, okay? As a red-green person, I won't gain weight as a blue, okay? But you can gain weight as a blue and a red, okay? If you eat the wrong foods and things. But the question is, what actually makes people gain weight? And this is always a very interesting question. And we'll delve into that later on today. But I can tell you it's nothing to do with your glands. strangely enough. Nothing to do with your glands at all. And it's nothing to do with exercise either. Okay, good. We have people on, 500 calories and, have real problems. And as soon as they come off 500 calories, they gain the weight again. And people who exercise for hours every day and just about maintain their weight. And some of them exercise and do the diet. It's nothing to do with that, interesting. It's nothing to do with all these fancy hormones called leptin and all the other things, insulin levels and so on. It's much more fundamental. It's very, very simple, really, what it is. And I'll show you what it is a bit later on. Okay, so for Paul, we know that his dominancy is his gonads. Okay, so any problem, whatever problem it is going to be related to his steroid hormones. And we'll see the steroid hormones from the gonads are really, really important, particularly if your adrenals are knackered out, okay, and vice versa. The worst thing you can do is have your gonads removed, okay? Because if you have your gonads removed, you're then relying upon your adrenals, okay? But if your adrenals are exhausted, you're then relying upon your gonads. And believe it or not, as I say, the gonads can take over. And they take over certain hormone production, like cortisol, and other ones which you don't necessarily associate with gonads. But it's the same family. The only difference is that the targeting hormones, which switch the gonads on or activate the gonads as opposed to the adrenal, from the pituitary and the hypothalamus are different. Okay? But it's the same hormones. So we see many of the problems that people have are actually adrenal when they're suffering so-called gonadal problems and vice versa. So we'll find that people with, for instance, low testosterone and erectile dysfunction tends to be low adrenals, not low gonads. They're pumping away in their gonads, but they're not switching it on from the right corticotrophic releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. They're putting on the adrenal corticotrophic, from the pituitary, and they're putting the gonadal one in. Okay, so they're switching the wrong gland on. And this is people who've got a lot of stress, and as a result of the stress, particularly when they've got a green aspect to them, down goes the adrenal steroids. Okay? So then they rely upon their gonads to back it up. And the gonads can't produce always the sufficient hormones that they need the adrenals to go with it. So the most important thing is to hold on to all your glands. The most important thing next is to not take glandular extracts or synthetic hormones unless you've really got to. If the gland is knackered out, then fine, you may need to support it. But it's much more important to try and get your own gland to work again. And usually the reason for this is our usual combination of either you're deficient in something or you're toxic. And usually it's a combination of the two. Usually there's a toxicity, which might be chemicals, which are big influences on the hormonal system, as we'll say. It could be toxic metals, or it could be exposure to different forms of ionizing radiation. It could be deficiencies, and we'll see what sort of the common deficiencies are, which malfunction our glands. And it can be sometimes what we eat. We can be eating the wrong foods. For instance, a blue person eating a lot of dairy is going to have a real poisoning effect on them. Okay? So also, if you eat too much wheat, if you're a red person. Okay? So you've got this awful balance. When you're a red-blue, blue-red, you're fighting this eternal struggle between dairy on one side and wheat on the other. And you're reacting at times to both of them. Okay? So both are going to have an inhibiting effect on your metabolism. And that will shut down your glandular system. There could be other reasons, temporary with infections, temporary lack of exercise, etc. But the big ones are lack of the right nutrients in the diet, eating the wrong foods, and exposed to the wrong chemicals or toxins within the environment. Okay? So those are the big things to look at. And we fight this battle all our life, is exposure to toxins. Can we detoxify? Do we get the right nutrients? Do we get the right things from our foods? And we'll see what are the right things from our foods. And they may not always be the things that you necessarily anticipate. Okay, thank you. We'll have you back a bit later. Can I remind you of what? Yeah, how do you test for the dominant eye? It's the one that weakens when you put the acetate over both eyes. Okay, in Paul's case, when we did the initial test, the blue was over both eyes, okay, and he weakened. But then I did it individually, and it was only the right eye that weakened, the left eye didn't. The left eye I then went to green and to red, and he weakened to red. So we'll call him a blue, dominant, and red is his less dominant. Okay, we won't call it recessive because it's not quite like that. Now, if we gave him a remedy which helped his gonads, you know, let's say for argument's sake we gave him some gonadal tissue extract, okay, and that would keep his testicles happy, okay, but his thyroid will say, well, what about me? So he would suddenly change to being a red. Okay? Now, you often find this with red people who got red and blue. So some of you will be red dominant and blue less. Is when you get an infection, you tend to go to blue dominant. Now, when I get a heavy toxicity low, because I'm red with a little bit of green, if I get a real toxicity, particularly if I eat potatoes and the deadly nightshade family, then I'll become green dominant. All right? So in other words, I will swap. So any remedy that you do or any approach must deal with both sides if you've got a mixed dominancy. And the only way you can do the two things at the same time is to put the two acetates on, either here or here, and work with the two all the time. Okay? It's lucky for us, you know, it's nice when you get a patient who is a blue-blue, a green-green, or a red-red. It makes our life very much easier because you haven't got to worry about that. But most people are, in fact, mixes. So if they're mixes, let's work with the two acetates at the same time, and then you'll start to find things which help people which you never thought of or dreamt upon. And, you know, some of those things which really work better than anything else are the very simple substances within the foods that we eat, spices that we've talked about before, culinary herbs, minerals, the right types of oils in the diet. You don't need anything else. Okay? People aren't going to be that responsive and deficient to specific, obscure Brazilian jungle compounds. Okay? They're going to be local things indigenous to this particular country and what should be normally within their diet. Okay, how are we doing? So I think are we breaking now? Let's just, before we break, let's just finish off about the colours and then we can move forward from there. Now, I often show this and it just helps to remind us of that energy is the key to everything. That energy that we use within the human body we call ATP, and ATP is made in the mitochondria, particularly in the membrane of the mitochondria, and we charge and discharge just like a battery continuously, but we do that thousands of times a second. Okay? So when we talk about an energy of a person, we talk about the chemical energy. But energy is also in different forms, and we can measure energy when it changes its form, but nobody really knows what energy is. There's no definition of energy. There's a definition of when it's in a particular form. Now, light is the ultimate form. Without light, there'd be no life at all in the whole of the universe. And we know that light is made up of the 7 colours of the rainbow, and that when you take any of the elements in the universe, and there appear to be 99 or 98 stable ones and a few artificial ones, but those are the same over the whole of the universe. And every single element, when it's in an excited state, in other words, you heat it up or expose it to more energy, will emit a particular colour. And it's like a barcode. So on here, we've got what's called a spectroscopic emission. This is how you can tell this is aluminium or aluminum. Okay? Is if you warm it up and then take an infrared picture of it, it will emit a particular waveband. And the point about this is that this emission, the biggest emission, is at 619 nanometers. And that's the exact spectroscopic emission colour of the red cone in the human eye. Okay? If we then put the aluminium atom into a ground state, in other words, we discharge it, it absorbs energy. Okay? It's like a black hole, it absorbs it. And you can see the top part here, the absorption, is again the biggest width band here is 619. So spectroscopic emission and absorption are just two sides of the same coin. All right? And what we're looking for is what the biggest barcode is. And the biggest barcode is 619. And that makes red people very susceptible to aluminium. So on your initial visit with a patient, or subsequent ones, and you've got a red patient, and you are struggling a bit, what the devil is wrong with them, think aluminium, as far as their toxicity, think wheat. Okay? And think that they've probably got a shortage of B6 and maybe the other Bs, and maybe they need iodine within there, something like kelp as a superfood, if you like, to boost them up. So simple things, but very, very fundamental. And you'll find those, particularly when you work with the complementary colours, as we'll see around the umbilical area. Greens, you'll see here, 550 is the biggest spectroscopic emission and absorption, and this is of nickel, and this is the same with the green people. So it's the green cone, the exact yellow part of the green. So people weakened to green, this is why they have a strong affinity to nickel. And that nickel can be irritating to green people if it's in a jewellery or a piercing, or sometimes even if it's just on the skin. And that irritation may not be local to where the metal is exposed. So you could have a ring, but you could have inflammation somewhere obscure, or an eczema or skin problem. Most metals will come out of the body through the skin. They should come out through the urinary system, but if we don't detoxify, they find their way out through sweat and things. So sweat, irritation, cysts and things under the arm are classical toxins coming out. And finally, the blue person, the biggest spectroscopic emission absorption is at 440, which is the exact spectroscopic absorption colour of the blue cone. And you'll see here we've got this whopping great bar in the mercury band. And we're all exposed to mercury every day now. Now, where are we exposed to mercury every day? Fish. Well, we don't all eat fish. What? Teeth, yeah, teeth amalgams. If you've got light bulbs, yes, the dreaded new energy-saving light bulb. What's inside there? Mercury vapor, which is why you shouldn't throw them on the ground. Okay, supposed to dispose of them correctly. And what's it doing? It's lighting up, isn't it? And what's it doing is it's sending out a spectroscopic emission. And what's it sending out is sending out this waveband. And if you're blue, you're in trouble. Okay. I'm okay, I'm fine, I'm not blue, I can take all the mercury in the world. I can eat all the fish, everything else, you see. But don't give me aluminium light bulbs. Not to lick anyway. Okay, so we all have our little ups and our downs. People say, well, what's the best colour to be then, Chris? So I say, well, neither, and none of them obviously is the best. And when you get that person's energy, they're balanced right up to perfection, then they shouldn't weaken to any of the colours. Okay, but we're yet to meet too many people like that. Okay, but that's what you've got to try and achieve, is somebody who doesn't fall weak to a particular challenge. And light wave bands are one of the biggest challenges that we have to face. And those are the only things we can measure. You can imagine if you put a dose of ultraviolet or cosmic on you and can measure it, but we don't have a way of emitting that to do the challenge. But the visible spectrum is bad enough for most of us. So mercury, nickel, aluminium, think of those. With the blue person, think lactose, think mercury, think alcohol. Get them off all dairy products.